Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10 of Poll 205 Women in Politics. This week, we're discussing special interests and campaign finance. So in today's lecture, we're going to tackle some pretty big questions. We're going to talk about what are special interest groups, how do special interest groups influence voters and elections. In order to do this, we have to go over a brief history of campaign finance law and history. We need to discuss the role that money and financing play in contemporary elections. And then I want to kind of wrap up with a conversation about the role that interest groups play in American politics. Do they corrupt the institutions of politics, or do they simply seek to influence the American politics process? So by the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define interest groups and articulate the key differences between interest groups and political parties. You'll also be able to identify different types of interest groups and whether they're motivated by private, public, or ideological interests. And then we'll also spend some time talking about the different types of activities that interest groups engage in and how they influence government, things like lobbying, electoral activities, and the pivotal role that PACs and super PACs play in influencing our politics and our elections. And lastly, we'll discuss the role that money plays in American elections, as well as some of the gender differences and who donates and whether men or women candidates raise more money in their campaigns. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to begin with a stop and think moment. I'd be really curious to hear your initial ideas and thoughts about interest groups in this week's discussion board. And first, I'd like you to think about whether any specific groups or organizations come to mind when we think about interest groups. Now, many people have difficulty putting a name to an interest group, so if you can't think of one, that's okay. Whether you can name a specific interest group or not, you've probably heard a couple of opinions about interest groups. Overall, how do you feel about interest groups? Do you think that they're mostly good, mostly bad, or what? Do you think that they make our democracy better, or do they make our democracy worse? And lastly, I want you to think about the role that money plays in campaigns and elections. I know personally for me, anything over $1 million really feels like monopoly money, and I can't even fathom what that amount of money would look like in my hands, but I want you to give it your best guess about how much money you think is dumped into our elections. And at the end of this lecture, I'll share some statistics with y'all that I'm curious to hear whether you underestimated or overestimated the amount of money that goes into our elections. And I'd love to hear your ideas about whether you think this amount of spending is effective or whether we could take all of that money and put it to better use. So go ahead and pause the video, reflect on these prompts, and when you're ready to proceed, go ahead and hit play. Okay, so first, before we do anything else, I want to talk about the difference between political parties and interest groups, because there's a lot of really important overlap here. So political parties can be understood as an organized coalition of interests that seek to influence government and policy by getting members elected to public office. Interest groups, quite similarly, are an organized coalition of interests that seek to influence government and policy, but by petitioning and educating elected officials on specific issues. So unlike the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, interest groups in the United States are relatively small and typically organized around a discrete set of issues. So while parties structure the institutions of government, such as the committee system in Congress, interest groups petition government as outsiders. While parties structure the electoral system through candidate recruitment, control over the nomination process, and influence over the rules of the electoral game, interest groups, on the other hand, they work at the grassroots level to educate voters, to raise money, and to increase awareness on their respective issues. The relationship between interest groups and parties is much like a sports analogy. The two major parties, we can think of them as like the opposing teams in politics. And interest groups, we can think of them like their biggest fans. They make large donations of time and resources and money to the parties. They try to influence the direction and decision-making of the parties, and they try to recruit the best players to run as candidates under party banners. Nonetheless, they are not the parties, and they must rely on the parties and candidates to win the game. So what are some of the key differences between interest groups and political parties? Here's a few facts I'd like you to keep in mind. Interest groups are designed to advocate for narrow and specific interests. Because politicians have to represent very different and very diverse constituencies, they often don't have expert level knowledge on every single issue facing their district. This is where interest groups step in and help educate politicians on how they think politicians should legislate. So broadly speaking, the purpose of interest groups is to influence elected officials and educate voters on specific issues. Political parties, on the other hand, their main objective is getting candidates elected, specifically those who will represent the party well and help achieve partisan objectives. And now I want to dive into the differences within interest groups. And a key way to differentiate among interest groups is to categorize them as either private or public interests. Private interests refer to those that benefit select individuals or groups without benefiting the whole. So this includes things like business, labor, professional, and trade associations. These groups seek to secure economic or monetary benefits for their members and their members only. These are benefits that are not generally available to non-members. So for example, the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, or the AFL-CIO, works in support of stronger labor laws for its union membership. So you have to be a member to reap the benefits of that initiative. Public interests, on the other hand, benefit the whole, regardless of whether you're a member or not just select individuals of groups in society. So the key distinction here is that everyone in society benefits from the actions of public interest groups, even if they are not a member of that group, because the types of policies they try to achieve directly benefit everybody in society. So the Sierra Club is a great example of a public interest group. It draws attention to issues concerning the environment, such as finding clean energy solutions and limiting greenhouse emissions. So even if you are not a member of the Sierra Club, we all benefit from policies that make our air clearer and our water cleaner. And often within the realm of public interest groups, though they can sometimes be private as well, we have various ideological interest groups, which, like it sounds, is primarily interested in promoting ideological or issue-specific agenda. For instance, the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, or NARL, is united by a common concern for women's reproductive rights. In particular, the group is focused on protecting access to abortion procedures for women. Conversely, you also have the Natural Right to Life, which is one of the oldest and largest anti-abortion interest groups in the country. The National Rifle Association, or the NRA, is another great example of an issue-specific interest group that works to protect all Americans' Second Constitutional Amendment rights. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this, the NRA has excellent Christmas cards, so I encourage you to Google that later if you're so inclined. But you'll also notice that these ideological interest groups are often comprised of proponent and opponent groups. So just as the NRA advocates for expanded gun rights, the Giffords Institute advocates for restricting gun rights. And finally, there's quite a few religious-oriented interest groups that seek to represent religious institutions and values, such as the Christian Coalition of America or even the Satanic Temple. Fun fact, there's a 2019 documentary called Hail Satan, which explores how this group has become increasingly active in pursuing legal challenges to laws that have really blurred the lines between church and state. At any rate, if you've ever heard of interest groups before, chances are it probably hasn't been very positive. And while there's generally a lot of really negative connotations associated with interest groups, which we will talk about in a lot of detail in just a moment, one thing worth keeping in mind is that interest groups play a pivotal role in our society. They serve as a crucial mechanism that helps individuals with narrow or specific issue agendas bring those matters to the attention of the broader, more generalist political parties. In fact, I dare you to find an interest group that is not not represented by an official interest group. And maybe this will be a good exercise in the discussion board if you want to accept my challenge. But there's the United States Association of Reptile Keepers, which I am almost positive people like Joe Exotic and Tanya Haddix must be members of. There's the Balloon Council, which I had to look up. What do they even do? They work to educate consumers and regulators about the wonders of balloons and the proper handling of them. Who could forget about ADOGA, the American Dehydrated Onion and Garlic Association? And without the prune lobby, who would have known that prune patties offer a delicious and affordable plant-based alternative to the traditional hamburger? The point is, if there is an interest, there is a group. And on the topic of lobbying, let's talk about what exactly that is for a moment. Lobbying is basically any political activity that aims to influence government policy making. And one way to think about it is that lobbyists are essentially professional protesters. So just as protesters gather with signs and slogans outside of the Capitol to convey messages to national policymakers, lobbyists often use power and influence and money, though not always, to persuade and influence policymakers. In fact, anyone can attempt to lobby the government. All you have to do is get a group of people together to petition an elected official. But usually, right, it takes some amount of power, influence, or money to get your foot in the door of the politician's office in the first place. So what exactly do lobbyists do during these meetings with politicians? Well, first and foremost, a lobbyist's job is to provide current and meaningful information to lawmakers. Remember, politicians are generalists. They can't be experts on every single issue that affects the country. So lobbyists, who are experts in very specific areas, help fill this information gap. Second, lobbyists help distill complex issues into major talking points for politicians. So here we can think about highly complex scientific or technological issues that politicians might need help understanding themselves before they decide how to legislate or regulate that issue in Congress. AI is a really great example. Third, lobbyists can offer legislative language to lawmakers to help appeal to voters. Sometimes lobbyists even write laws for Congress, known as model bills, which seems like a wild conflict of interest, but it's actually perfectly legal. One of such boogeymen you'll often hear about is ALEC, or the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is an ideologically conservative interest group that has a reputation for writing highly controversial model bills that do things like restrict abortion rights or expand gun rights. But make no mistake, ideologically liberal interest groups are just as guilty. So here's an example of a model bill that seeks to regulate law enforcement that's sponsored by the ACLU. So one reason interest groups have such a negative reputation is because they're essentially a group of unelected individuals who are writing laws for Congress. Another reason interest groups are so detested is because they have a long history of buying off politicians and government agencies. Dopesick, which is an original series on Hulu, explores the opioid epidemic in the United States and delves into the rise of prescription opioid addiction, focusing on the role played by pharmaceutical companies, particularly Purdue Pharma, the manufacturer of OxyContin. And the show basically plays out like this. You have Purdue Pharma, who sends a bunch of lobbyists to the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, whose primary job, by the way, is to make sure that our food doesn't have lead in it and that the drugs that we take won't kill us. And so Purdue Pharma says, hey, can you please authorize us to sell OxyContin? We promise it's non-addictive. And the FDA says, I don't think so. It's a derivative of opium. I'm pretty sure it's super addictive. And Purdue Pharma says, okay, listen, we're going to make tons of money. If you just approve it, we'll pay you twice as much to leave your job at the FDA and come work for us at Purdue Pharma. And the FDA essentially said, you have a deal. And that's really concerning, right? Like, we shouldn't have pharmaceutical companies or any corporation for that matter sending lobbyists to government agencies that's primary job is to regulate those industries and then say, hey, just quit your job with the government regulatory agency that you work for and come work for us and we'll pay you a whole bunch of money, right? Like, that is the reason why the opioid epidemic exists in this country. And it's also one of the main reasons that Boeing aircraft are literally imploding mid-flight. It's because Boeing lobbyists bought off the Federal Aviation Administration, which allowed employees at Boeing the power to regulate themselves. And that's proven to be a horrifically fatal decision. However, lobbying activities are not exclusively reserved to petitioning government officials. In fact, there's a variety of activities that interest groups engage in with the purpose of educating and mobilizing voters and informing the public on specific issues or policies. Many groups also keep track of the voting records of individual members of Congress on specific issues. For example, the American Civil Liberties Union tracks congressional votes and scores the percentage of time each member of Congress voted with or against a stated ACLU position. In fact, as we get ready for the general election this November, I encourage you to check out this resource, votesmart.org. You can search for any politician, view objective analysis of their policy platform, or you can even enter your own address to learn more about the politicians who represent you at every level, the local, state, and federal level. So if you're old enough to vote this upcoming election, do check out this resource. It's super helpful, it's nonpartisan, it's super objective, and it can help you make a more informed decision when you go vote this November. On a different note, another highly controversial activity of interest groups is the formation of political action committees, or PACs. PACs are organizations established by individuals or private groups with the aim of raising money to contribute directly to candidates for elective office. And PACs have been around since about the 1940s, but where it gets really interesting is, depending on the size of the group, PACs can raise large sums of money to contribute to the campaigns of like-minded candidates. So we've got some major questions here, right? Do interest groups purchase access to politicians? Do interest groups buy off politicians? And do interest groups exert too much influence in politics? These are the questions that we're going to focus on for the remainder of the lecture. And in order to understand how we got to where we are today with money playing such an insane role in our politics, we have to go down a brief detour in history on campaign finance reform. So in the aftermath of Nixon's Watergate scandal, which grossly misused campaign donations, Congress passed the Federal Election Campaign Act Amendments of 1974. And what a major cornerstone of this legislation is that people could donate unlimited money to parties, but they were limited in the amount of money that they could contribute directly to a candidate. And note, direct donations to candidates are referred to as hard money. However, parties were still able to funnel money directly to candidates. This was known as soft money. Fast forward a few years later, we have the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, or the BCRA, in 2002. This marks one of the most recent pieces of major legislation geared towards limiting spending by candidates and advocacy groups to influence elections. Now, this was introduced by Republican Senator John McCain and Democratic Senator Russ Feingold, and the act faced considerable opposition from lawmakers, interest groups, and citizens who saw it as a violation of the First Amendment right to free speech. The BCRA essentially replaced legislation from 1971 that limited the amount that individuals, organizations, and PACs could donate to election campaigns. The original law, the FECA that we just talked about, distinguished between hard money for candidates and soft money for campaigns. It targeted hard money by limiting individual contributions to $1,000 and PAC contributions to $5,000. The BCRA also placed no restriction on soft money contributions. Then in 2008 is when the rules of campaign finance began to really come off the rails. The BCRA also included provisions regulating electioneering communications, which are defined by the FEC as those communications that refer to a federal candidate in the days leading up to an election. So the BCRA aimed at limiting issue advocacy ads sponsored by groups like 527 organizations unaffiliated with a particular candidate from flooding media media markets within 30 days of a primary election or 60 days of a general election. It further prohibited corporations from using treasury funds to sponsor these types of ads. And in 2008, a conservative political organization called Citizens United attempted to broadcast a lengthy political advertisement, which was really a short film, critical of Democratic presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. And the film was entitled Hillary, the Movie. And this documentary was funded through corporate and individual donations, and it was set to air during the primary phase of the presidential election, but ultimately it was blocked by the Federal Election Commission. However, in Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission in 2010, the Supreme Court struck down sections of the BCRA that banned political advertising by corporations, specifically by citing First Amendment protections, that this was a violation of corporations' First Amendment rights. And this controversial decision was alternatively hailed by supporters as a victory for free speech rights and condemned by critics as a corruption of the democratic process. Its full implications for the role of money in elections still remains to be seen. But perhaps the most damaging impact has been the legal precedent set that corporations are essentially granted personhood. They're given the right to free speech, and that spending money is a form of speech expression. In fact, many legal scholars argue that the notorious Supreme Court case Hobby Lobby v. Burwell in 2014 would not have been decided the way it was if it wasn't for the decision in Citizens United. For context, the 2014 Hobby Lobby case revolved around the issue of whether or not a business could deny its employees birth control as a part of its insurance coverage on the grounds of a religious objection. So David Green, the CEO of Hobby Lobby and devout evangelical, believes that the use of birth control to be tantamount to murder. And shockingly, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Hobby Lobby in this case, which essentially allows businesses and corporations the right to deny birth control as a part of its health insurance coverage on the basis of a religious exemption, which is horrifying because essentially what that does is it prioritizes the rights and privileges of massive multinational corporations over the rights of individual employees and human beings. Nonetheless, the ruling in Citizens United is also directly responsible for the creation of super PACs, which are independent political action committees that may raise unlimited sums of money from corporations, unions, and individuals, but it is not permitted to contribute or coordinate directly with parties or campaigns. That's what makes PACs distinct from super PACs. And so what's the big deal here with super PACs? They can't contribute directly to campaigns, so why does it matter? Well, the answer depends on whether you believe a deluge of corporate dollars in American elections stymies the democratic process or not. And now let's just spend some time looking at the money. Here we've got a graph showing us the amount of money spent on elections from 2008 to 2020. And what we can see is there are some shocking increases over the last few presidential election cycles. Most recently, in 2020, we can see that we cracked $14 billion just on presidential and congressional spending alone. So I want you to think back to the stop and think moment and how much money did you say that you think we spend on elections in this country? Was it close to $14 billion? Because it's a pretty insane amount of money. And it's only getting worse. We won't know how much money we have officially spent in the 2024 election cycle until it's all over, but some estimates suggest that it's already in the ballpark of $10 billion, which is a significant increase from where we've seen previous election cycles. And I want you to think about what we could do with that money instead. The amount of money spent on campaigns in 2020 was equal to the entire budget of the United States Department of Commerce. That's enough to give $1,066 to every single American who is currently enrolled in college in this country. So who gives to campaigns? Well, approximately 16% of Americans make at least one donation to a political campaign in a single election. A little less than 2% of Americans donate $200 or greater, and individuals who donate more than this are known as mega donors. And let's talk about the characteristics of mega donors. Men donate at significantly higher rates. Of the top 200 donors in 2014, where data is most recently available, only 2 of those individuals were non-white, and most mega donors are over the age of 50. So when we want to talk about the role that money plays in politics and, whether or not that makes politicians more beholden to those interests over the general public, we also have to consider that the group of people who are injecting the most amount of money into our campaigns are frighteningly, demographically, very, very similar. What kind of impact does that have on the representativeness of our candidates? And who are they most accountable to? And then we have to talk about the gender gap coming full circle with respect to campaign finance. Fundamentally, the opportunity to compete is not equal. Some of the wealthiest occupations in this country are dominated by males. We have normative and societal expectations of women to be mothers that has a direct impact on the ability to earn the same wages as men. It should come as no surprise that women have less disposable income to contribute to political campaigns. But, however, in 2020, women's financial participation in politics dramatically increased. Here we can look at this data that goes all the way back to 1990, which shows us the percentage of large dollar donations to federal political campaigns who are women. And by the time we get to 2020, almost half, about 44% of all of those large dollar donations were coming from women. So we see a great increase in economic mobility with respect to women and how much they're donating in campaigns. But when we look at the data kind of separated by the magnitude of a contribution, we still see dramatic gender differences. So when we're looking at individuals who donate anywhere from $200 to $2,700, we see almost gender parity there. Almost 50% of those individuals are men and 50% are women. But what happens when we go into a higher bracket donation? Individuals who give more than $2,700. Well, we start to see that is less women and more men doing that spending. What about individuals who spend more than $1 million in any given election? Well, only about a quarter of those individuals are women. So we still see that when it comes to mega donations, individuals donating $1 million or more in a given campaign, 75% of those donations are coming from men. And you might think to yourself, well, what are the consequences of more women donors? Are women more likely to give to women candidates? And yes, based upon trends in recent data, we see that women donors are nearly twice as likely than men to give to women candidates. We also see that women congressional candidates are raising more money than men on average, but because there are so many more men who seek office, the raw cash that male candidates are able to bring in for their campaigns is higher overall. Now, to bring our conversation full circle, let's talk about the ultra wealthy. You might be surprised to learn that 42% of all campaign donations come from the ultra wealthy, meaning that a handful of individuals are able to exert enormous influence over our campaigns and elections. But why is so much money spent on political campaigns? Well, there's 3 points that I think explain why money is so pivotal in American elections. So first, candidates' ability to raise money early in the campaign signals to the voters, to the media, to challengers and donors that this campaign is viable, that this campaign is serious, and that helps these campaigns gain momentum and a greater following. Second, campaigns, especially those that are competitive, are very expensive. There are staffing concerns, events and logistics, and most importantly, where most of the money goes, advertising. And then third, recent changes to campaign finance law allow special interest groups to spend unlimited amounts of money for their candidate of choice. So it's only natural that we see year after year after year, more and more money flowing through our elections. Today, just 11 donors, a bipartisan collection of hedge fund billionaires, entrepreneurs, media magnates, and a casino mogul, have contributed more than 1/5 of the total $4.5 billion collected by super PACs ever since their inception in 2010. And the intense concentration of money shows how just one tiny group of super rich individuals has embraced these political groups, which have emerged as indispensable allies of candidates and political parties. Super PAC money plays such a pivotal role in influencing politics that the Republican primary is now jokingly referred to by political insiders as the Adelson primary. Over the last decade, Republican presidential candidates line up at Sheldon Adelson's door in hopes of clinching his endorsement because it comes along with an influx of tens of millions of dollars to support their campaign. Sheldon Adelson has since passed, but his wife Miriam continues to play an enormous role in financing Republican candidates' campaigns for office. And again, I have to reiterate this is not a problem that plagues just one party. We see mega donors overexerting their influence in American politics within both parties. It's not a Republican problem. It's not a Democrat problem. It's an American politics problem. So at the end of the day, we have to ask ourselves, do politicians represent us, the people, or the mega donors who hold the future of their political viability in their wallets? Now, you have some people who argue that interest groups aren't all that bad. In fact, some suggest that it's a broad misconception that interest groups attempt to buy influence or votes in Congress. Interest groups often do contribute money to political campaigns, but they tend to focus on only those candidates who would otherwise support their cause in the first place. In other words, these organizations don't buy off their enemies, they sponsor their friends. They use their money to help those who are already ideologically aligned with their cause and thus most likely to bring about the changes they seek in government. So rather than buying votes, interest group money buys access, as politicians are more inclined to spend time with those who have financially contributed to their election. Take gun rights, for example. Republican candidates have received much support from gun right interest groups than have Democratic candidates because it is the Republican Party that tends to be about expanding gun right access, whereas Democrats want to restrict gun access. We see a similar pattern with the business sector donations. Unsurprisingly, business-oriented groups are significantly less likely to donate to Democratic candidates because Democrats often advocate for stricter regulations and taxes on businesses. There's also significant cleavages among educational sectors who are significantly more likely to donate to Democrat candidates because they typically advocate for increased government spending on education. Almost every issue you look at, you'll see a similar partisan division when it comes to following the money. So overall, is lobbying and special interest groups and super PAC contributions all just politics as usual? Or is all of this indicative of something a little bit more nefarious? Well, let's turn to the recap to answer that. Interest groups allow for the representation of diverse interests, from the pressing matters facing members of the Balloon Coalition to, all the way to those who fight for clean air and water and lobby Congress to take action on climate change. Interest groups are a key component of American politics that allow the people to bring the issues that matter most to them directly to government. Interest groups allow advocates to inform generalist politicians on narrow policy issues. On the other hand, there's certainly no dearth of examples when it comes to the more negative implications of interest groups, as we'll continue to see throughout this course, interest groups can obstruct the policymaking process by threatening to withhold campaign contributions if congressmen don't vote the way they want on big bills. And those with the most resources, i.e. money, have disproportionate influence in government, and together this chips away at our trust in government, and it fosters a belief that the government doesn't work for people like us. It only works for big interests and people with deep pockets. So be sure to let me know what you think in this week's discussion boards. Do you think that interest groups are a crucial mechanism for our democracy, or are they more trouble than they're worth? Well, everyone, that's all I have for you this week. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and learned something new. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next one.